I should have checked the weather before heading out. The rain started in the late afternoon, coming down in a slow drizzle at first, soaking into the ground, turning the dirt into thick, heavy mud. I was miles away from anyone, deep in the woods, setting up camp by a narrow, winding river. The trees were tall and packed closely together, their branches swaying under the weight of the rain. The air smelled of damp earth, pine, and the faint metallic scent of wet stone. I had chosen this spot for its seclusion. It wasn't a designated campsite, just a clearing I had found on an old map, a place where few people ever wandered. It was the kind of spot you'd never know existed unless you were looking for it. I had taken a rough trail to get here, one that was more of an overgrown path, barely visible in places. My boots were caked in mud by the time I arrived, and the rain was already seeping through my jacket. I pitched my tent near the river, making sure to keep a safe distance from the bank. The ground here was uneven, covered in fallen leaves and slick roots. I worked quickly, driving the stakes into the ground, pulling the rainfly tight. The sound of the river mixed with the steady tapping of rain against my tarp, creating a rhythmic noise that filled the air. It was peaceful in a way, but also isolating. As I unpacked my gear, I felt the cold settling into my bones. My fingers were stiff from the damp air. I set up a small fire, just enough to warm my hands and dry my socks. The flames flickered weakly in the rain, struggling against the moisture-heavy air. I sat close to it, watching the embers glow, listening to the sounds of the forest. The woods had a different feel in the rain. The usual rustling of small animals was muffled, and the usual chirping of birds had faded away. It was too quiet, aside from the occasional creak of tree branches or the distant splash of the river. I was used to being alone on camping trips, but something about this place made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way the trees stood so close together, their trunks dark with rain, their branches twisting overhead like tangled fingers. As night fell, the rain picked up. It came down harder now, a steady downpour that hissed as it struck the river. My fire was barely holding on, its glow shrinking against the wet air. I decided to turn in for the night, crawling into my tent and zipping myself inside. The inside was dry for now, but I could hear the rain drumming against the fabric, the sound constant and heavy. I lay there listening. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a branch snap. It wasn't the kind of noise that comes from a branch simply breaking under the weight of water. It was deliberate, sharp, quick, like something had stepped on it. I tensed, holding my breath. The rain masked a lot of sounds, but that one had been close. I waited, listening, my heart thudding in my chest. Nothing, just the rain, just the wind shifting through the trees. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. Probably a deer moving through the woods, maybe an old branch giving way under its own weight. I forced myself to relax, closing my eyes, letting the sound of the rain lull me to sleep. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up again. Something had changed. The air inside the tent felt heavier, thicker. The rain was still falling, but there was another noise now, a faint, rhythmic sound. Footsteps. I held my breath. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They crunched against the wet leaves, moving just outside my tent. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Who would be out here? This was deep in the woods, far from any main trails. No one should be here. No one else should even know this place existed. I lay still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps moved closer. They stopped just outside my tent. I could see the faint shadow of something standing there, just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. The rain distorted the shape, but I could tell it was tall. Human, just standing there. My mind raced. I hadn't heard anyone approaching earlier. No voices, no distant sounds of movement. Whoever this was, they had walked right up to my tent without making a sound until now. I gripped the handle of my knife, keeping it close to my chest. Minutes passed. The shadow didn't move. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, just as slowly as it had come, the shadow disappeared. The footsteps retreated, fading back into the rain. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but the way my body was reacting told me otherwise. My instincts were screaming at me. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting, nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came, gray and cold. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet, the sky still heavy with clouds. I unzipped my tent slowly, my muscles stiff from tension. I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the damp earth. And then I saw them. Footprints. They circled my tent. Not just once, over and over. Someone had been walking around my tent for a long time. The prints were deep, pressed into the mud. I followed them with my eyes, my stomach twisting into knots. They led toward the trees, disappearing into the undergrowth. I turned, scanning the woods. Nothing, just trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. I packed my gear quickly, my hands shaking. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of wind, made my skin crawl. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone watching me. The hike back to my car felt longer than before. The woods, which had seemed peaceful the day before, now felt suffocating. I moved fast, barely stopping, my heart hammering the entire time. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. My hands were slick with sweat. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the trail one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw movement. A figure standing just beyond the trees, half hidden in the shadows. Watching, I didn't wait to get a better look. I drove away, not stopping, not looking back. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't want to know. All I know is that I won't be camping alone again. Not out there. Not anywhere. It had been nearly a year since my ex-wife, Amanda, passed away. We had been divorced for 3 years before she died, and by then we had barely spoken. But when I got the news, it still hit me harder than I expected. I never thought I'd care so much, but grief has a way of creeping up on you when you least expect it. At first, I kept myself busy with work. I stuck to my routine, waking up early, going to the office, coming home, eating dinner alone, and falling asleep in front of the TV. It was a dull, predictable life, but it kept my mind from wandering too much. Then one evening, after a long day at work, I found myself sitting on the couch, staring at the framed picture of me and Amanda from when we were still together. We had taken a trip to the mountains, spent a week camping in a secluded area, and I remember thinking back then that it was one of the best times of my life. That's when I decided to go camping again. Not to relive memories with her, not to chase some ghost of the past, but because I needed to get away. I needed space, fresh air, something different from the routine I had trapped myself in. I packed up my gear, checked the forecast, and drove out to a remote part of the woods in northern Montana. I had been there once before, years ago, but never deep enough into the wilderness to be completely alone. This time, I wanted solitude. The drive was long, nearly 6 hours from my home. The further I got from the city, the more the roads turned into winding paths, flanked by dense forests on both sides. By the time I reached the dirt road leading to the campsite, the sun was beginning to set. I parked my truck at the edge of a clearing, grabbed my backpack, and set off into the woods. I wanted to be far enough from any trail or main road so that I wouldn't hear another soul. I walked for nearly an hour before I found the perfect spot. A small clearing near a stream, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. Setting up camp was easy. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and lit a fire as the sky darkened. Sitting by the flames, I felt more at peace than I had in months. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the distant rustling of leaves as the wind passed through the trees. I didn't expect to feel so comfortable, but that comfort didn't last long. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easy. The woods at night were alive with noises. I had camped before, but never this deep into the wilderness, never this far from other people. Every snap of a twig made my ears perk up. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to something moving outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just the sound of light footsteps, moving slowly, carefully. I held my breath, listening. My mind raced with possibilities. It could be a deer, a raccoon, maybe even a coyote. I reached for the flashlight next to me, but before I could turn it on, the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I waited, listening, but there was nothing. No movement, no wind, no insects, just dead silence. I stayed awake for what felt like hours before exhaustion finally took over. The morning brought back a sense of normalcy. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds chirped, and the stream nearby flowed steadily. I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the sounds from the night before. I spent the day hiking. I followed the stream deeper into the forest, climbed a rocky hill to get a better view, and even fished for a bit. For the first time in a while, I felt okay. But as I made my way back to camp in the afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, leading up to my campsite, stopping just a few feet from my tent. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw no one. I told myself it had to be a hunter passing through. That made sense, right? Someone probably saw my camp, got curious, and left. I shook it off, made a fire, and forced myself to relax. That night, I woke up again. This time, the footsteps were closer, not just near my tent. Asterisk, asterisk, right outside. Asterisk, asterisk, I lay there, heart pounding, listening as the slow, deliberate steps circled my tent. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. A long, dreadful silence. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Then, asterisk, asterisk, the zipper of my tent moved. Asterisk, asterisk, someone was trying to open it. I reacted immediately, grabbing the zipper from the inside and yanking it shut. At the same time, I shouted as loud as I could. Not words, just noise, an attempt to scare off whoever was out there. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, I heard rapid footsteps running into the woods. I waited, listening. The footsteps faded into the distance, swallowed by the forest. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I wanted to leave. I packed my things the moment the sun rose. But as I was stuffing my sleeping bag into my backpack, something caught my eye. Something lying just outside my tent. A knife. A hunting knife, old and rusted, lying on the ground as if someone had dropped it there. That was it. That was enough. I grabbed my gear, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started hiking back toward my truck. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything, but I felt something. Presence. I reached my truck just as the sun was fully up. I threw my gear into the back, got in, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I looked into my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw him. A man standing just at the tree line. Not moving, not hiding, just standing there watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a gas station miles away from the woods. I never reported it. What would I say? That some stranger watched me in the woods? That he left a knife outside my tent? There was no crime, no proof, nothing but my fear. but I never went camping alone again. And sometimes, late at night, I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys the quiet of the outdoors. I work a desk job in a city that never slows down, so anytime I get the chance to step away, I take it. The last few years, I've gotten into solo camping. Long, isolated trips into deep forests, places where I don't have to hear car horns or office phones ringing. This trip was supposed to be no different. I had planned it for months, setting aside a full week to explore a remote stretch of wilderness in Montana. The area was perfect. Miles away from civilization, dense with old trees, quiet rivers, and long, winding trails that barely saw any foot traffic. I drove out early in the morning, my truck packed with everything I'd need: food, a tent, sleeping bag, a small hatchet, a hunting knife, and my rifle, a .308 bolt action I always carried on solo trips. I had enough supplies to last me well over a week, just in case. The first 2 days were exactly what I'd hoped for. The weather was perfect, and I didn't see another soul. At night, the only sounds were the wind in the trees, the occasional rustling of small animals in the brush, and the distant howl of coyotes. It was peaceful, but that peace didn't last. On the third night, something changed. That evening, I set up camp in a small clearing near a river. The sun had just dipped below the treetops, and the sky was a deep shade of orange. I had already gathered enough firewood for the night and was heating up a can of chili over the flames when I heard it. Something moving in the trees behind me. At first, I assumed it was just a deer, but then I noticed how slow and deliberate the movements were. Not the quick, cautious steps of an animal, but something different. I turned my head, scanning the tree line, but I couldn't see anything. Then, everything went silent. Anyone who spends time outdoors knows that the forest is never truly quiet. There's always the hum of insects, the distant calls of birds, the rustling of leaves. But now it was like the whole world had stopped. Even the wind had died down. A heavy feeling settled in my chest. Something was wrong. I grabbed my rifle and stood up slowly, listening. My fire crackled behind me, casting long shadows through the trees. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone silent, the sounds of the forest returned. Crickets chirped. The wind picked up. Everything was normal again. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a large animal had passed through, startling the smaller creatures into silence. That was all. I forced myself to sit back down and eat, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore the area around my camp. I followed the river upstream for about an hour before looping back through the trees. That's when I saw them. Tracks. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft dirt, leading from the woods directly toward my camp. I crouched down, my stomach twisting. They looked human, barefoot, but something about them was off. The toes were too long, almost claw-like, and the stride was unnatural, too long, like whatever had made them had been running on all fours before standing upright. I followed them with my eyes, tracing their path. They stopped just a few feet from where my tent had been, then turned back into the trees. Something had been watching me last night. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding. I suddenly felt very exposed. I gripped my rifle tighter and scanned the woods around me, but nothing moved. I told myself it was some kind of animal, maybe a bear with a weird gait. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had come out here for a full week, and I wasn't about to let my imagination cut my trip short. So I stayed. I should have left. That night, I built my fire bigger than usual. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway and groan. It wasn't raining, but the air felt damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth. I sat with my rifle across my lap, staring into the flames, trying not to let my mind wander. Then I saw it, a pair of eyes, just beyond the firelight. They were low to the ground, reflecting the light like an animal's, but they were too far apart, too high off the ground. They didn't blink, they just stared. I tightened my grip on my rifle, my breath shallow. Then they moved, not forward but sideways, circling me. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering. I raised my rifle, aiming just past the fire. I couldn't see anything except those eyes, gliding through the darkness like they were floating. And then they were gone. The forest went silent again. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I packed up. I was done. I didn't care if I was cutting my trip short. Something was out there, and I didn't want to find out what it was. I started hiking back toward my truck, moving fast. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear something, a rustle, a snap. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Then, about an hour from my truck, I heard it, my own voice. It was coming from the trees ahead of me. At first, I thought I was losing my mind, but then I heard it again. Sounded like me, but wrong. The words were stretched, broken, like someone had recorded my voice and was playing it back at the wrong speed. Hey! It was distant, flat. Then, closer, hey! I gripped my rifle and backed away. The voice came again, from my left this time. Help! Then, from behind me, hey! It was everywhere. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I threw my gear in, started the engine, and tore down that dirt road faster than I ever had before. As I drove, I saw movement in the trees. A figure, tall and thin, running alongside my truck. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending wrong. It moved like a puppet with its strings cut. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it veered into the woods and disappeared. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. I haven't been back to that area since. I still go camping, but never alone. Never that deep into the wilderness. Sometimes at night, I think about those eyes in the trees, the tracks around my camp, the voice calling out from the darkness, and I wonder if it ever really stopped following me. Camping had always been my way of getting away from things. I wasn't the type to sit in a hotel or plan every little detail of a trip. I liked being out there in nature, away from the crowds where I could think clearly. I had done it plenty of times, mostly in the UK, but this time I wanted a change. A friend had told me about a place in France, somewhere deep in the countryside, away from tourists, where you could set up a tent and spend a few nights in peace. That was exactly what I needed. It was late September, just cool enough to be comfortable but not freezing at night. I packed light, just a tent, sleeping bag, food, a flashlight, and a knife, which I always carried when camping. Not for protection, really, just for cutting wood, cooking, things like that. I took my car across the channel and drove for hours, passing small villages and endless fields until I reached a wooded area that matched the description my friend had given me. The place was perfect. It was a dense forest, quiet except for the occasional sound of birds or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. There was no one else around. The nearest village was maybe 30 minutes away by car, and the nearest real road was just a dirt path leading into the trees. I parked my car a bit off the path and hiked in with my gear until I found a clearing by a small stream. That would be home for the next 2 nights. I set up my tent quickly and gathered some firewood before the sun dipped too low. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, listened to the sounds of the forest, and let myself relax. I hadn't realized how much I needed this. No stress, no people, just the quiet. The second day, I decided to explore the area a bit. I hiked through the trees, following the stream, and eventually came across an old wooden structure. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. A small cabin, barely standing, with rotting wood and a collapsed roof. I didn't go inside. There was no reason to, but something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't just that it looked unstable. It felt like someone had been there recently. There were footprints in the dirt near the entrance, and the door was slightly open, swinging just a little in the breeze. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing, just the wind in the trees. Maybe someone had come by recently, maybe another camper or a hunter. I left it alone and walked back to my campsite, shaking off the feeling. That night, things changed. I had my fire going, eating my dinner, when I noticed something. A sound. Footsteps. Not animals. Animals move differently, lighter, quicker. These were slow, deliberate. Someone was walking through the trees nearby. I turned off my flashlight and sat still, listening. The fire crackled beside me, but I heard it clearly. Footsteps circling my camp. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping my knife, trying to make sense of it. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited, heart pounding. Nothing happened for a long time. No movement, no sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there, watching. Eventually, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just an animal after all, or my imagination getting the best of me. I forced myself to lie down in my tent, keeping the knife close. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise made me jolt awake, but nothing happened. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints. Deep in the dirt, circling my tent. Someone had been there, watching me while I slept. I packed my things in record time. I didn't want to stay another night, but as I walked back to my car, I had the horrible feeling that I wasn't alone. The whole way, I felt eyes on me, hidden behind the trees. I never saw anyone, never heard another sound, but I knew someone had been there, and they had been close. I never went back. I don't know why I thought camping alone in a place like that was a good idea. I had done plenty of solo camping trips before, but this one was different. It wasn't some maintained campground with picnic tables and fire pits. This was deep in the woods, miles away from any town, in a spot I had picked out using a topographic map. The place seemed perfect on paper, far from any roads, near a small creek, and surrounded by thick forest. I wanted quiet. I wanted to disconnect from everything. What I got instead was a night that I still try not to think about. I drove as far as the logging roads would take me, then parked and hiked another few miles in with my pack. It was late afternoon when I reached the spot. The trees were tall and dense, the ground thick with fallen leaves and moss. The creek was just as I had expected, a narrow stream of clear water cutting through the land. It was the perfect spot until it wasn't. I pitched my small one-person tent on a flat patch of ground and gathered firewood. The woods were quiet, aside from the occasional bird call or rustling in the undergrowth. Nothing unusual, nothing that made me feel unsafe. As the sun started setting, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. I ate while listening to the sounds of the forest. I remember feeling completely at peace, staring into the flames as the sky darkened above me. That peace didn't last. It started with a feeling, a sense that something was off. At first, I ignored it. I was alone, deep in the woods. Of course, it would feel a little unnerving. But the longer I sat by the fire, the stronger it got. A tightness in my chest, the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the branches overhead. It sounded like whispering. I told myself it was just my imagination. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the dark. I forced myself to stay by the fire, to push the feeling aside. Then I heard it, a twig snapping, not the random sound of a branch falling from a tree. This was deliberate, the sound of something or someone stepping on it. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. My eyes scanned the darkness, but I saw nothing. The fire crackled, the wind whispered, but beyond that, the woods had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. I tried to brush it off. Probably an animal, a deer maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stay by the fire for a while longer, but I couldn't relax. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling, a shift in the darkness. Eventually, I decided to turn in. I banked the fire so it would last through the night, then crawled into my tent. I left the rain fly off so I could see the stars through the mesh. I lay there listening. The wind, the creaking trees, the occasional crack of cooling wood from the fire. Then something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, not the scurry of a small animal. Heavier. I held my breath. The sound stopped. Minutes passed. Then, just as I started to convince myself I had imagined it, I heard it again. Closer. Couldn't just lie there. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly in my hand. I listened for what felt like hours, every nerve in my body on edge. At some point, exhaustion took over. I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of something moving right outside my tent. Not walking, breathing, a slow, deep inhale. I stopped breathing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only a faint glow. The woods were still silent. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. No footsteps, no retreating noise, just gone. I lay awake until dawn. As soon as the first light filtered through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The fire was cold. The air was damp. I scanned the area. Nothing looked out of place. No tracks, no signs that anything or anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up my gear quickly, my skin crawling the entire time. I had planned to stay another night, but there was no way I was spending another second out there. I hiked back to my car in record time. The entire way, I felt like something was following me. I never saw anything, but the feeling never went away. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. I sat there for a long moment, just breathing. I haven't been back to that place since. I don't plan to. Whatever was out there that night, I don't want to know. I had been planning a solo camping trip for months. It wasn't my first time heading out alone into the woods, and I felt confident about my experience. I had all my gear, a good understanding of the terrain, and I wasn't the type to take risks. The location I picked this time was a national forest in Montana, somewhere far enough from civilization that I wouldn't see another person for miles, but not so deep that I'd be completely cut off. I had a solid GPS, plenty of food, and enough knowledge of the area to know what I was doing. I had camped alone before, and I liked the quiet. The first day went by without much trouble. I parked my truck at a designated camping area, then hiked out several miles to a secluded spot near a small river. It was early fall, so the days were still warm, but the nights were cold. The trees were starting to change color, and the crisp air made everything feel fresh. I found a good clearing and set up my tent, making sure I was on flat ground and away from any dead trees that could fall. I collected firewood, checked my gear, and set up a small fire as the sun went down. It was peaceful. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the occasional splash from the river. That night, I slept well, only waking up a few times when I heard distant animal noises, normal for the wilderness. I had my bear canister secured away from my camp and a knife within reach, but I never had any real concerns. The next day, I spent my time hiking around, gathering more firewood, and just enjoying being alone. It was the kind of trip I had been looking forward to for a long time, until things started to feel off. That evening, as I was preparing to cook dinner, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't alone. First, I brushed it off. I hadn't seen a single person since I left my truck, and I was miles from the nearest road. But the feeling wouldn't go away. As I ate my food, I kept looking over my shoulder. The trees were thick and the undergrowth was dense. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, something made me uneasy. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise outside the tent made me tense up. I kept telling myself it was just the forest. Small animals moving through the brush, the wind shifting the trees. But there were moments when the noises didn't feel random. It was like someone or something was moving with purpose. At one point, I was almost asleep when I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps just outside my tent. Not the light scurrying of a raccoon or the heavy movement of a deer. These were human steps. I lay completely still, my heart pounding. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. I listened, straining to hear past the sound of my own breathing. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a soft rustling, like someone shifting their weight. I wanted to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I knew better. Someone was out there. Minutes passed. The footsteps didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just paranoia, and I must have imagined it. Still, I kept my knife close and barely slept. The next morning, I checked around my camp, looking for any sign that someone had been there. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then, near the edge of my camp, I saw it. A single boot print in the dirt. It wasn't mine. I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't seen anyone for miles. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. I packed up my gear quickly, deciding to cut my trip short. I wasn't about to stick around and see who else might be out there. As I hiked back toward my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound made my nerves jump. The feeling of being watched never went away. When I finally reached my truck, I felt a wave of relief. But as I loaded my gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the dirt near my truck, were more footprints. They weren't mine. They hadn't been there when I arrived. Someone had been waiting. I didn't stick around to find out who. I got in my truck, locked the doors, and drove out of there as fast as I could. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods, and I never will be again. I remember the camping trip with my gym partner like it happened yesterday. It was late autumn, a time when the days were shorter, the air was crisp, and the forests had an eerie stillness. We had planned the trip weeks in advance, choosing a remote area in the mountains where we could test our endurance, push our limits, and escape from the constant noise of everyday life. We weren't just gym partners. We were friends who thrived on competition, always challenging each other to lift heavier, run faster, and go further than before. This trip was supposed to be another test of strength, physically and mentally. We had chosen a spot deep in the wilderness, a place far from the crowded campgrounds and tourist trails. The plan was to hike for a full day into the backcountry, set up camp, and spend a few days in total isolation. No cell service, no distractions, just nature, survival, and the challenge of roughing it out. It seemed like the perfect plan. The first day of hiking went well. The trail was steep, winding through thick forest, with leaves crunching beneath our boots. The higher we climbed, the colder the air became. We had packed light but brought the essentials: tents, sleeping bags, enough food for a few days, and basic survival gear. Both of us were in excellent shape, but by the time the sun started to dip behind the mountains, we were exhausted. We found a clearing near a small stream and decided to set up camp. That night, the forest was quiet, too quiet. There were no sounds of crickets, no rustling of leaves from small animals, just silence, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. We ate in silence, both of us too tired to talk much, and eventually crawled into our tents. The exhaustion from the hike took over, and I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I realized I could hear something moving outside. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. At first, I thought it was my gym partner shifting in his tent, but then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Someone, or something, was walking around our campsite. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps weren't random. They moved in a slow, deliberate pattern, circling our tents. I wanted to call out to my gym partner, but something stopped me. An instinct, maybe, a feeling that I shouldn't make a sound. I stayed as still as possible, straining to hear. The footsteps continued, circling, pausing, then moving again. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I lay awake for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I didn't say anything at first. Maybe it had just been an animal, maybe I had imagined it. But when I stepped outside my tent, I saw my gym partner already awake, staring at the ground. There were footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They weren't ours. They were fresh, and they circled around our tents multiple times before disappearing into the trees. Neither of us said anything for a long time. We just stood there, staring at the tracks. Finally, we packed up our gear and decided to move deeper into the forest. Maybe it had been another camper, lost or curious. Maybe it had been a hunter, but something about those tracks felt wrong. There was no reason for someone to walk around our camp like that in the middle of the night. We hiked for most of the day, putting as much distance between us and the previous campsite as possible. By late afternoon, we found another clearing near a river and set up camp again. The feeling of unease from the morning had started to fade. Maybe we had overreacted. Maybe it was nothing. That night, it happened again. I woke up to the sound of movement outside the tent. The same slow, deliberate footsteps. I felt my heart pound in my chest as I listened. The sound was closer this time, much closer. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A deep, slow breath, right outside my tent. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The fabric of the tent was thin, and I could feel the presence of something just beyond it. My mind raced. Should I grab my knife? Should I make a noise? Should I stay silent? The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, slowly, disappearing into the night. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out of my tent, my body still shaking from fear. My gym partner was already up, his face pale. He didn't have to say anything. I knew he had heard it too. We didn't waste any time. We packed our gear as fast as possible and started hiking back. We didn't talk much. There was nothing to say. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone following us. By the time we made it back to the car, the sun was already setting. We threw our gear in the back and got in without a word. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing at the tree line, watching us. But there was nothing. We never went back to that place again. We never talked about what happened. But to this day, I still wonder, Who was out there in the woods with us? And what would have happened if we had stayed one more night?